Well, hi folks, Mark here again, and this is episode 53 of Reexamining the End Times, and again we're doing that through the lens of my 2024 book, The Threshold of Exile. We're kind of taking it through part by part as to how the book was constructed, and we now have reached the last part of the book. We're in the last part 4 of the book, and we're studying the book of Revelation. And of course, we've been raising questions about some of the popular end times thinking and the way some things are being interpreted in both in the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus talked about the wars and the rumors of wars and the days of Noah and all these things, and then also the book of Revelation. And I have suggested to you that much of what is taught today and understood today with a futuristic mindset concerning things happening in the last days or the end of the world are really no such thing, but they are expressions of biblical thought that deal with the end of the age, and that the vast majority of these things that we read about in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 and Mark 13, this great Olivet Discourse, as well as the book of Revelation, are actually fulfilled history. And I've tried to take you through not just some historical background and events that have occurred that seem to show very much a fulfillment of these things, but the texts themselves, and looking at how the scriptures interpret themselves, and looking back at some of the testimony of the prophets concerning the earlier fall of Jerusalem, and that many of these texts point to a reoccurrence which did in fact happen in 70 A.D. when Jerusalem fell. And much of what we see in Revelation, I believe, reflects that the war with Rome and the fall of Jerusalem. And I suggested there's been some different passages that we've seen in Revelation, different sections of Revelation that seem to really point that out pretty clearly. And we are now approaching Revelation 17 and 18. And I think that just understanding this whole idea of the harlot and the beast. Now, these are controversial subjects. How you view these things has a big effect, a large effect on how you view your whole outlook on Revelation, in terms of whether it's something that has to do with the end of the world or whether it has something to do with the end of an age. And we've tried to suggest to you that this whole idea of an end of an age, Jesus didn't really speak about the end of the world. He spoke about the end of the age. And to his disciples, that meant the end of the age of law, the period under law, and the transition into the new covenant era. The Jews called it the Olam Haza, which was their current age, and then the age to come would be the Olam Haba, and the time of Messiah was supposed to be the transition era. And we see this transition era throughout the Gospels, and we see it in Revelation, and how this would all come about with the final destruction of Jerusalem and the dissolution of the old system, the old covenant world, with that fall. And so as we come to, we tried to present that a little bit to you in 15 and 16, where we saw the scene in heaven, and we saw this kind of, what we said was sort of a liturgical thing, where we saw the angels decked in priestly garments, and as they prepared to pour out the bowls of wrath, not on the earth, but we said that the word here, gay, should be probably translated land, as these various things were happening in the land of Israel as the main theater of Revelation's conflict, as Rome was attacking and Rome was bringing about its forces to destroy the city. And I encourage you to go back and look at some of that, where we covered 15 and 16, because I think it'll be very enlightening. Now we're going to actually come, and we've got a kind of a new introduction to this image of Babylon. And I suggested to you several times through the course of these podcasts that Jerusalem, I believe Jerusalem is the Babylon of Revelation, and we're going to try to see if we can see that now as we enter this new section, where we see in Revelation 17 we have the harlot and the beasts are kind of identified, they're kind of described for us, and then in 18 we see a dirge for the fall of Babylon, okay? And so we're going to see if we can see some clues, not only within the text, but how other texts feed this text to give us some understanding. So in verse 1, we really begin, we're going to probably concentrate on verses 1 to 7 in this session concerning the harlot. and then we'll probably look at some things in Revelation 18 as well. And then we'll come back at the next podcast, and we'll try to unpackage this mystery, this riddle of the beast that John gives us in the later part of chapter 17. But we see this. We see this in verse 1 and verse 2. We see that one of the seven angels who had seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I'll show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." So first we're introduced to we're going to see this great harlot, and she's about to be judged. And of course what he tells us about it is that this harlot sits on many waters, and that later on we see in verse 15 that those are kings and nations. So this is a harlot, a city, an entity that has jurisdiction and has influence over many parts of the world. And we know, of course, that as it is now, it was then that the Jews were scattered throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the civilized world, and yet Jerusalem was the control center of these Jewish people, and they would come to Jerusalem for festivals and various things. And so the hub of Jerusalem the hub of Israel remained Jerusalem. And so this woman is one who sits on many waters. Her influence sits over this. The waters would be representative of the sea. Then we learn, it says that the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell in the land were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And so now we see this, not only does she have influence, but something about her is not what it is supposed to be. She's become immoral, and she's the kings of the earth, the kings of the land maybe here, have committed acts. In other words, they're participating in her immorality, and those who dwell in the land were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And of course, becoming drunk is being influenced by wine. And so under her commercial and powerful enterprises have caused others to partake of this and be a part of it. And in just looking at how, just to stop a minute and just look at how the prophets and how Jerusalem is described. And then again, we're speaking of ancient Jerusalem, the first century Jerusalem, how the prophets actually described her. And it says in Isaiah 121, how the faithful city has become a harlot. She who was once full of justice, righteousness once lodged in her, but now murderers. In Jeremiah 2:20, he says, for long ago, he speaks to Israel, for long ago I broke your yoke and tore off your bonds, but you said, I will not serve. And from under every high hill and every green tree, you have played the harlot, or laid down as the harlot. In Hosea 2, we read that, contend with your mother, contend, for she is not my wife. I am not her husband, and let her put away her harlotry. Matter of fact, the whole text of Hosea really deals with Israel as a harlot. And so her harlotry is a way of describing her unfaithfulness to her marriage covenant with God. That is her idolatry. There were unjust social and commercial practices, dependence on foreign nations. These were all described as harlotry in the Bible. And so Israel is really in Jerusalem. We say Israel and Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem is a descriptor for all of Israel, just like Pharaoh represents Egypt or Nebuchadnezzar represents Babylon. And so Jerusalem as the city, as the hub, really represents the whole nation. And so now David Chilton will help us here for a minute. We're going to take a look from his book, The Days of Vengeance. And he states that Tyre and Nineveh are the only two cities outside of Israel or outside of Jerusalem that are accused of harlotry. Both had been in covenant with God. The kingdom of Tyre in David and Solomon's time was converted, and her king entered a covenant with Solomon and assisted in building the temple. And we read about that in 1 Kings and in Amos. And then Nineveh was converted, if you recall, under the ministry of Jonah in Jonah 3, 5, and 10. But later, each of these cities departed from covenant with God, and therefore they were designated as harlot. But neither Tyre nor Nineveh have any contextual affiliation with the book of Revelation. That's important. We don't really see anything about these two cities in Revelation. That leaves Jerusalem as the only city, the only other city mentioned in the entire Bible, to be a harlot. Now, the suggestion that Rome, which is the popular view by many, that Rome is the harlot city, really has no corroborating scriptural witness. There's no evidence that anywhere in Rome's history that she was ever in covenantal relationship with God. And that's very important. She would have had to have a covenantal relationship with God, which is seen in with these other cities as kind of a marriage contract. But to have a covenantal relationship and then break it through apostasy or however rejecting God is equated with harlotry. And we have Tyre, we have Nineveh, which have no relationship whatsoever to the book of Revelation, and then we have Rome, who many think is the harlot of Revelation, but she has never had a contractual relationship with God. Okay, so there's no way that we would want to designate that as a harlot. Okay. Now, we said in verse 2 that the kings of the land are drunk on her immorality. Remember, Jesus said that this immorality, this merchandising, this commercialism that was so present in Jerusalem. Remember in Mark 11, we should point this out. Let's take a minute to read Mark 11, if you will stick with me here. In Mark 11, you all know the story of Jesus, of course, cleansing the temple because of the merchandising that was going on and his rebuke of the people. But in Mark 11, and if we go to 15 and 16, I'll have it for you here in a second. 15 and 16, Jesus driving the money changers out. Now notice it says they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were, now get this, drive out those who were buying and selling. It isn't just those who were selling, but they're coming from all over to buy from merchandise from Jerusalem. So it's not only the sellers, it's the buyers as well, and overturning the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves, and he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And he says, he began to teach them, saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a robber's den," or a house of merchandising. And so, see, Jerusalem had become in that day a major religious and commercial center for Judaism. There was commerce. It was a main artery lined with shops. It was a central marketplace. Herod the Great had done tremendous, extensive building projects and expansion of the temple, which brought thriving commercial environment. It was a well-organized urban plan that facilitated trade and housing. The lower city was the commercial hub. The upper city is where the elite lived. The Temple Mount was, of course, the religious and political center where the Sanhedrin met to convene on matters of the political matters as well as religious issues relating to the temple and the cultic matters of the nation. And then we just see that now with this mass of people coming in from the nations, from both around Israel as well as the surrounding areas, Jews coming from all these areas to come and participate in this whole merchandising of the house of God and the temple of God, and the anger that the nation had slid into such a commercialized center as opposed to what God had originally intended for it. It was to be a holy city and a holy temple, and here Jesus is condemning them by telling them they've made it a house of merchandise. They've made it a commercial setting, a commercial enterprise, and this was once God's holy house, and man, it's just departed from what he intended for it. Now, he says in verse 3, very interesting, he says, "He carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw the woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns." Now, the great harlot is sitting on this scarlet-colored Roman beast, and this scarlet-covered beast has all of the characteristics, just like we read in Revelation 12 and 13. The red dragon, the Satan himself, has integrated himself into the Roman Empire, and who we then see in between Revelation 12 and Revelation 13, we see the dragon and the beast have the same characteristics. And so John is now seeing this woman, this harlot, riding on this Roman beast, okay? And so she's now really, this is an image of her being in league with the beast. This is an image of her using the beast, okay? So she's, we're going to see her described as having the cup full of the blood of the saints and her lavish adornment and all this stuff. And she's riding and using the beast, okay? And so as we go further, we're learning here that John sees something. He sees something interesting. He says he's led away into a wilderness. Now, I think this is fascinating because what we have been talking about in this era, this period of Israel's history, was that from the time of Jesus up unto the fall of Jerusalem, 70 years, is a 40-year period where the Jews were where? They were in the wilderness, okay? This was a wilderness time of testing. It was a probationary period before they entered Canaan. So here what we see is a replay, in a sense, of what we saw in the book of in the Old Testament after their exodus from Egypt. Now look at follow with me with the types. Israel went from slavery in Egypt, right? And today, or at the time of Jesus, man was in slavery to sin. The Passover occurs after this release from the Exodus. In the Exodus, we are told that Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us in 1 Corinthians 5 and 7. Then they crossed the Red Sea in Exodus 14. And Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10:2 that they were baptized by water and spirit. We are baptized by water and spirit as they were baptized into Moses. So we have these parallels. Slavery, Passover, baptism that is part of their exiting from the old world, the old life of slavery. But what happens next? They go 40 years. After the Passover is sacrificed, they go 40 years in the wilderness, okay? A probationary testing, okay? And so this all happens before they enter the land. And so where is this harlot? She's in the wilderness. She's living in this period, this transition period between what the old covenant world and then the new covenant promise. And she's under this probation. Instead of being a holy people coming into the promised land, she has turned into a complete harlot. She's compromised herself. She's using Rome. She's riding Rome. And now rather than following her Messiah, she's in league with the beast. And actually being in league with the beast, she's in league with the devil. She's in league with the dragon. Didn't Jesus tell them that you are of your father, the devil? They followed his practices. They did what he did. They gave themselves over to sensuality, okay? And so this nation has far fallen from God. And notice that she's in league with a beast, or this dragon, with blasphemous names. Of course, with blasphemous names, because the Caesars were recognized as God. They were given the title of deities, each one as they proceeded through history, through the series of the emperors that arose during that period. They were given the title of deity. Okay, and so this all again points us in the direction of the first century in Israel and their relationship with Rome, Jerusalem especially in relationship with Rome. And remember, we also said, just in terms of seeing it a little more clearly, is that we had mentioned that the pro-Roman faction, the Sadducees and the elite in Jerusalem did not want war with Rome. They were pushing. I suggested to you that this was the land beast of Revelation 13, that they were endorsing Rome. They were fighting against any attempts to rebel against Rome. Okay, they were encouraging support of Rome, and they led the charge even in Jesus' day when they spoke with one voice saying, crucify him, we have no king but Caesar. Okay, and so we see this city now that is riding on Rome's back. All right, and and we see in her attire as we continue on in Revelation 17:4 that she is clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold, precious stones and pearls, and having in her hand a cup full of abominations and unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead was written the name Babylon, the great mother of harlots, and the abominations of the earth. And carrying through to verse 6, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus, and I saw her and I wondered greatly. John is just marveling at this woman and her whole attire and her demeanor and what she's doing. Greg Beale, a great scholar, biblical scholar, has pointed out that this combination of words that describes her attire in the Greek of the Septuagint is the same language. He says the combination of words in the Greek is identical to the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the same as the high priest's garments. Isn't that amazing? She's got this priestliness, okay? So in other words, the city is being represented as having the role of a high priest, or at least an association with the Jewish priestly system. One interesting thing that's missing there, though, she no longer has blue. The high priest's outer garment was blue, which represented heaven, and this harlot is no longer adorned in blue. She's got all the pearls, she's got all the fancy stuff, she's got all the adornments, she's lavished with all these goods, but she's no longer blue. She's no longer a heavenly woman. She's now become a harlot. Then she's got a cup in her hands, and it says that this mother city of the land. Okay, she's the mother of the abominations of the land. The mother city of a land, which would be Israel in this case. Okay, was the capital city. It was the hub of everything for a particular nation. And so she's full of the abominations of the land, all right? And at the same time, she's got a cup of this commercialism, excess, injustice, immorality, and murder. And she influences the entire land, all right? So on her forehead is this high priestly, instead of the high priestly tiara, which Aaron wore, which upon his forehead said, holy to the Lord, holiness to the Lord. Her forehead is described as having no shame. Okay, she's open for business and advertising it. Jeremiah 3:3, he says to Israel, therefore the showers have been withheld, and there have been no spring rain, yet you had a harlot's forehead and refused to be ashamed. And so here she resembles this very description that we get from Jeremiah concerning Israel, that this she's advertising. She's no longer bearing this holiness to the Lord tiara. Now it's painted on her forehead is this harlot's forehead. So here I am, open for business. Verse 6, she's drunk with the blood of the saints. Looking ahead to Revelation 18:24, we learn that in her was found the blood of the prophets and the saints and all who have been slain on the land. Now this should ring a bell for us. In Luke 13:33-34, Jesus says, it cannot be that a prophet would perish outside Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stoned those sent to her. In her is found the blood of the saints and the prophets. Jesus said that it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside Jerusalem. Further down, we go to Matthew 23, and he says that you who murder the prophets, how will you escape the judgment that's coming? He says in Matthew 23:35-6 that upon you will fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the land. And I explained to you there previously that it's not all the blood on the earth. Okay, it's the blood on the land. He said, the land of Israel, the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say unto you, these things shall come upon this generation. Now we know that although Jesus and the first century Christian martyrs fell at the hands of the Romans, Paul held the Jews responsible for this. It was them riding on the back of Rome, okay? It was them riding on the back of Rome, using Rome to do their bidding. And so what we read, for example, is in 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16. For you, brethren, he writes to the Thessalonians, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea, For you also endured the same sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out, with the result that they always fill up the measure of their sins. And we see something similar in Acts 4 and 23 and following, where when Peter and John are released from prison, they pray, how that the nation of Israel and Rome colluded to both kill the Lord Jesus and now persecute the church. And so the whole point here is the harlot is the one who is being held responsible. In her hand, in her cup, is the blood of the martyrs and the saints. This is not Rome. This is the Jews of that time, of that generation, that were being held liable, responsible for the blood of Jesus and the apostles and prophets that were sent to her to send them the message of the gospel. Okay. Now, in verse 7, Jerusalem is now called the great city in Revelation 11:8. Jerusalem is called the great city in Revelation 11:8, and this is obvious because the text states that this is where the Lord himself was crucified. The harlot is also referred to in Revelation 16:9, 18:10, and 18:19 as the great city. Revelation's own self-witness supports first century Jerusalem as the harlot. Note Jeremiah's description of Jerusalem, the great city destroyed for having forsaken the Lord and worshiping other gods. And in Jeremiah 22:8 and 9 we read, "And many nations will pass by this city," that is Jerusalem, "and every man will say to his neighbor, why has the Lord dealt thus with this great city? And they will answer, because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord their God and worshipped other gods and served them." And so similarly, in Revelation 16, we're going to see that the beast turns, this Roman beast turns and does what? The same thing as Nebuchadnezzar did. He turns and he ravishes and destroys and consumes and burns the city with fire. Okay. And so when we talk about this idea of a great city, outside of Jerusalem, only Nineveh and Gibeon are designated as such, but neither, again, has a place in Revelation. Babylon is not mentioned as a great city until the book of Revelation. The occurrence of that phrase, the great city, in the Bible as follows. Genesis, once, and referring to Nineveh. Joshua, in the book of Joshua, one verse referring to Gibeon. Jeremiah, one verse referring to Jerusalem. Jonah, 4 verses referring to Nineveh. Revelation, again, 8 verses referring to Babylon. What we say is Jerusalem. This great city is the Jerusalem of Revelation. Okay? Now, let's see if we can get this under our belt. How do we make Jerusalem, the connection with Jerusalem as Babylon? I mean, there's no clear statement, no clear explicit biblical reference that ties Jerusalem to Babylon. So, for example, we saw in the earlier text, Revelation 11, that the city is Jerusalem is spiritually called Sodom in Egypt, and so we've seen how the judgments came upon her in Revelation 16 that were similar to the judgments upon Egypt. Her judgments are seen in Isaiah 1:9 as just like Sodom. Okay, and so we can see this connection where Jerusalem is likened to Sodom and Jerusalem, where it's explicitly stated. Even Edom, Paul draws in Galatians, Paul draws this sharp distinction between Abraham's two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And he draws on the story from Genesis 21, the expulsion of Ishmael. And we read in Galatians 4:22 and following, "For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by the bondwoman and one by the free woman. But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, the son by the free woman through the promise." This is allegorically speaking, for these 2 women are 2 covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are slaves. She is Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But you, brethren, are like Isaac, the children of the promise. So here we even see Jerusalem being kind of likened to Edom, which is also Paul likens that very in a similar way to the same way in Romans chapter 9, where he speaks about Esau and Jacob and Esau. And so we have what I'm trying to get at here is we have these connections that you can see where Jerusalem is tied to certain other images, but we don't see that clearly in about Babylon. So how do we make the case? How can I make this case that there is this association in the Bible between Babylon and Jerusalem? I mean, after all, you think Babylon as the destroyer of Jerusalem wouldn't make much sense that they are Jerusalem. Well, I think first what we need to do is go back and look at Israel's ancestral foundations. Okay, God called Abram or Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans. This was a city in the Babylonian Empire, and although Abraham's heritage was Hebrew, he was culturally Babylonian, possibly even Amorite. The Lord, calls Abraham in Genesis 15. He says to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it." So we know that Abraham was called out of this land, this culture, into a place where God would have the people of Israel to inherit it. By the 6th century BC, fast forwarding about maybe 1400 years, the Jews have been established but divided nation under their kings for several hundred years. They continued in idolatry. God sends Babylonians, of all people, to invade and destroy the city and the temple, and many Jews are exiled back to Babylon. After 70 years, many Jews, when King Cyrus defeated Babylon, took over Babylon, and he allowed the Jews to return to their homeland, many Jews chose to remain in Babylon, okay, because they'd already established a lifestyle there, okay. They had already established Babylon as a new homeland. I'm Italian. My grandparents were immigrants from Italy, and they spoke Italian. They learned some broken English after coming here. My parents are first-generation American born, and were basically bilingual, probably my father much more than my mother. God rest their souls. By the time it came to me, okay, the third generations or 2 full generations from that migration, I don't really speak Italian. My dad always told me, you're American, speak English. I know a little gibberish here and there, and I used to know when he was cussing at me, but the fact of the matter is my cultural heritage was the United States. I'm American, okay? And so I grew up with using the English language. Well, these people who came out of Babylon was the place of their birth, their livelihood. They were accustomed to the culture. Like Abraham, their ancestral heritage did not alter the fact that they were culturally Babylonians. Even though they were Jews, they were culturally Babylonians. Even from those who left, the whole new generation of Jews only knew Babylon as their normative culture. Even their language, they came out of Babylon. Even those that left and came back to the land of Israel, they no longer spoke Hebrew, they spoke Aramaic. And actually, by the time of Jesus, Aramaic, or the dialect among the Syriac languages, they spoke that language. And they still spoke. Jesus probably spoke, his dominant language was probably Aramaic, although some say he may have known some Greek, having grown up in Nazareth. The point being is, you have a people who have a strong tie, even though they had been conquered by Babylon and their temple and destroyed. These new generations had no intimate connection with Jerusalem, the city, and the temple, and so they were culturally, their language and culture was much came out of Babylon. Many strange traditions came out of Babylon that were still oral traditions. Later on, they actually were written down. When the Talmud was finalized a couple hundred years later, guess what the most authoritative biblical resource is for the Jews outside of the Torah itself? The Babylonian Talmud. You see, so much was accomplished in this sort of foreign environment in which they lived. Rabbi Beryl Wine, I hope I'm saying that correctly, he's an American Orthodox rabbi, offered this. He says, the Jews who were exiled to Babylon after the destruction of Judea established a Jewish community that lasted continuously until modern times, a period of more than 2,500 years. Babylon came to feel like home in many ways. The Talmud points out, and he cites the Talmud, that after all, Abraham had come from there. Furthermore, the Babylonian language, Aramaic, was close to the language of the Jewish people. And so we have this connection now in terms of their language and culture of a people who have come out of Babylon, and there's a completely different feel for their whole life and culture now. It's been influenced by Babylon. So you begin to get a picture here that when God's calling them Babylon, okay, he's talking about some people who have been strongly influenced, not only by Babylonian language and culture, but even some of the mystical traditions of their myths. And there's more to say about that for sure, but the ancient Greek and Babylonian myths regarding the underworld had much to do with their understanding of the afterlife, which has been actually influenced Christianity. But this whole thing about this woman being Babylon, she's become something that God never intended her to be. She's a mystery. He calls it a mystery Babylon, okay? Mystery, as I've gone over a couple of times with you on this, is in the Bible, among other things, is the joining of two into one. So, in other words, the mystery of Christ is the mystery of the man and the woman becoming one. Paul says this is a great mystery, but I speak of Christ and the church becoming one. This is a mystery. Well, now we have Judaism and Babylon becoming one. They become one in a city that no longer resembles what God had desired for it to be. There was sensuality, there was commercialism, there was everything that God never intended this city to be. Okay. So finally, let's see if we can connect these ideas between 17 and 18, because I don't think I'm going to go fully through chapter 18, but I want you to see the links between 17 and 18. In 17:2, we said that there were the kings of the earth or the land committed immorality. They were drunk with the wine of her immorality. They were influenced by her immorality. And in 18:3, we see the nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her immorality. The kings of the earth, the kings of the land have committed acts of immorality with her. Merchants have become rich by her wealth. And also in 18:9, the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensually and with her. Now we're seeing another feature. We see description of the harlot in relation to the empire, but now in 18 we're going to see the harlot's destruction, and this is a dirge, because those who live sensually with her, it says they will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning. And this, of course, is the burning of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem. In 17:4, we talked about her clothing. The precious stones not having any blue coloring, with a heavenly coloring. We see the same thing in Revelation 18:16. She's described as a great city, clothed in fine linen, etc. Okay. Revelation 17:5. On her forehead is the name Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations. She cried out with a loud voice in 18:2, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's become the dwelling place of demons and the prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. Now I want to pause for a second so that we can go back to Matthew 12, and I want to read something to you. In Matthew chapter 12, beginning at verse 43, Jesus talks about, in the previous verses, about judgment coming upon that generation because they didn't repent. But notice what he says in 43. Now, when an unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest, and does not find it. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came, and when it comes, it finds it unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and takes along with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there, and the last state of the man becomes worse than the first. That's the way it will be with this generation. What's John describing? What Jesus just said. He said that Jerusalem had become the place of demons and prison and of unclean spirit and a prison for every unclean and hateful bird. Actually, the word there could be even. He's describing it almost poetically, that the prison of demons and unclean spirits is a prison symbolically of unclean and hateful birds. In 17:6, drunk with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus, 18:24, and in her was found the blood of the prophets and the saints and all who have been slain on the land. Again, this takes us back to what we quoted in Matthew 23. Upon you will fall the blood, the guilt of all the blood shed on the land. 17:18, we see the great city. 18:19, we see again, woe, 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 the great city, and all who had ships of the sea and became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she's been laid waste. And notice in 18:19 it says that they threw dust on their heads. This is very much a Jewish mourning. Okay, this is not something that's done today. It's not something that's done in any near future. This is a Jewish act of mourning. Okay, and repentance, that great sorrow. Okay, that they're watching their city burn. And then finally, 18:22 and 23. I want to pay attention to this. And the sound of the harpists and the musicians and the flute players and the trumpeters will not be heard in you any longer, and no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer, and the sound of the mill will not be heard in you any longer, and the light of the lamp will not shine in you any longer, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride will not be heard in you any longer, and for your merchants were great men of the earth, because of the nations who were deceived by your sorcery. Now, I want to close because this is an interesting description. And if we go back, I want to read 3 texts from Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, regarding the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, and see if we can see how John, by the Spirit, is mining Old Testament reality and applying it to a current situation that's coming upon the nation of Israel and Jerusalem. In Jeremiah 7, he says, the dead bodies of this people will be for food, for the birds of the sky, and for the beasts of the earth, and no one will frighten them away. In verse 34, it says, then I will cease from the cities of Judah and from the streets of Jerusalem the voice of joy, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, for the land has become a ruin. Sound familiar? Of course, that's precisely what John's telling us in Revelation 18. Now we go up to Jeremiah 16. Jeremiah 16. And verse 9, again, with the destruction of Jerusalem in view in 586 BC. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I'm going to eliminate from this place, before your eyes and in your time, the voice of rejoicing, the voice of gladness, the voice of the groom, the voice of the bride. Okay? One more time, if that's not enough. In Jeremiah 25 and verse 10. Let's go up to 9, because this is the judgment coming from a foreign nation. Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I will send Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, very interesting, my servant, he's doing the Lord's will, and these nations round about, and I will utterly destroy them and make them a horror and an everlasting desolation. He's talking about the Jews, the destruction of the Jewish nation in 586 BC. Again, moreover, I will take from them the voice of joy, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, and the sound of the millstones and the light of the lamp, and the whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. See the connection? This is the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD is being connected intimately connected to the things that were described not only by the prophets of Jerusalem as a harlot, her condemnation, and then specific statements made by prophets, the prophet Jeremiah, regarding what would happen to them as a nation. We see that same context lifted out and placed in front of us in 70 AD when John sees the same scenario playing out to the generation of Jews in his time. So I hope that helps. I know it's kind of dense, and I probably struggled with it myself a little bit because there's just a lot there to try to cover. But I'd like to suggest to you that Jerusalem of that generation in 70 AD is the Babylon of Revelation. And that being the case, it now puts this whole book into a new context. It's not something off into the future, but John's seeing a present day reality in his time that's about to take place. God bless you. Thanks for tuning in.